faith, family, freedom, hope, and opportunity. You're listening to Freedom Rings. I'm your host, Senator Blackburn. I like to say that when you think about preserving this great country of ours, faith, family, freedom, hope, and opportunity are right at the top of the heap. And today we have somebody who truly focuses on those issues every single day in his work. Timothy Head is joining us for this episode of Freedom Rings, and he is the executive director of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, where he and his colleagues defend our shared conservative values in each and every day. And I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more about him and about the work that they are doing at the Faith and Freedom Coalition to stand up for our values. So, Timothy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a treat to be with you this morning, and always a treat to be with any senator. But for our money, you have been a clarion on issues related to faith and freedom for years and years, both in the U.S. House and certainly in the U.S. Senate. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the work that you're doing at Faith and Freedom Coalition. Tell our listeners a bit about the organization and where you place your emphasis.
You bet. So, one way that we sometimes say it is that our organization, Faith and Freedom Coalition, is it exists to support public policy that is built around a biblical worldview and within a constitutional framework. So there are certain biblical values that may also kind of fall outside the bounds of what we think are appropriate for either a federal or state government, and then also sometimes there are legitimate things that a government should be doing that may not necessarily be predicated on some biblical values or principles. And so we're trying to marry those biblical values within a constitutional framework. So we work on probably 8 or 10 different subject matters for the most part. Certainly issues related to life, innocent life, marriage and family, religious liberty, Israel, kind of on the federal side. Also do a lot on education, on immigration, on human trafficking, and on our justice system. And so those are probably the main kind of silos, if you will, of policy. We certainly are here in Washington, D.C., working on the Hill on a daily basis. Now we have 24 state chapters across the country, and that continues to build. We'll normally start 3 or 4 new chapters a year. But a piece that's a little bit unusual for a lot of think tanks, if you will, is so we work on those policy issues, but we also have the other wing to the plane. So we have what we refer to as voter education. So we are actively on the ground every election cycle, making sure that voters know where candidates stand on the issues. And so, in 2020, we had just shy of 200 million voter contacts, including about 5.95 million doors that we knocked. And so we just started in August that door knocking program, and we have a national voter database that has about 43 million identified faith voters. And so we basically just pepper those voters to make sure that nobody has the excuse of not knowing either A, when an election is, or B, where candidates stand on issues. And so, I think when you design a group to both activate voters and then also stand on principles and policies, you have the ability to kind of maximize impact on true kind of live legislation on the federal and the states levels. And
so you are educating for state races and federal races each, correct?
That's right. So we will have this year we have a total of about 112 different races that we've kind of targeted. So those are 23, I think, state gubernatorial races. We have about 19 or 20 states, U.S. Senate races, and then we have about 43 or 4 U.S. House races that we're kind of drilling down on. So it's and then there are a handful of kind of attorney general races, lieutenant governor races that kind of are state specific, and so we kind of touch on the federal side and the state side, and for our money, it's one analogy maybe is trying to cook in the kitchen with the wrong ingredients. If you have the wrong people in office, you can kind of advocate until you're blue in the face. But when the right people are in either state legislatures or in the U.S. House and Senate, the White House for that matter, you can kind of it becomes green lights all the way, So we can kind of tinker a little bit instead of having to reroute a whole river. And you know what it's like to try to reroute rivers here in Washington D.C. It's
yes, we do. When you all have people coming to your website and following your social media, looking at issues in this post-pandemic world, what are the things that bring them to you to find out where candidates stand and to get this education?
Well, that tends to kind of change a little bit with the tides. So in 2022, interestingly enough, right now, it's a combination of we're getting a lot of queries on issues related basically to crime and safety. That seems to be a very kind of top of mind issue. We're always concerned about that as Americans, but unfortunately, we've seen a pretty significant uptick, especially in a lot of city centers. Large centers have seen. I don't think it's any big secret now. Some pretty serious upticks on that front, and then clearly, inflation is impacting all of us directly or indirectly. Some pretty badly, some really, really badly. In Nevada right now, their inflation over the last basically 18 months is looking at almost 18% inflation. So even if you're a pro-life voter or a pro-Israel voter, for instance, in Nevada, inflation is going to be probably top of mind for you. And then immigration, certainly border related issues. So those are the three probably prevailing issues right now for us. Interestingly, life for most faith voters, the questions of life always are kind of either top of mind or sort of circulating.
They're a part of the equation.
So, a lot of people are excited about what happened in Dobbs, the Dobbs decision, about 3 months ago now. They may be articulating public safety, immigration, inflation in the economy, but there's also a real interest, now that that's become more of a state issue.
Correct.
They're very interested on the state level to make sure that either their governor, the Speaker of the House, their Senate majority leaders are going to be pretty active on life-related issues in those respective states.
That is so interesting, and I would imagine with your background, having served as a missionary, and you were in Asia and Europe each, correct?
That's right.
And how does that affect your view on foreign policy when you look at what is happening with what I call the axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea?
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways that feels like another life ago that, when I was in largely India and Nepal and Pakistan, but also kind of into Tibet areas, so parts of China, was able to, when I was in China for sure, obviously interacting with the Chinese government, but also in Nepal and some other areas like that, interacting with people who were mindful of China, we'll just say. And then, and similarly, when I was in Pakistan and a little bit in Afghanistan, certainly dealing with a lot of challenging. Matter of fact, I was there kind of at the height of power of the Taliban in those kind of regions of the world. So, when you're talking about totalitarian regimes, you really see kind of the daily sort of practical effect that a very oppressive government has on just normal people. Obviously in those areas of the world, there aren't very many Christians, generally Hindus and Buddhists, and a lot of obviously Muslims in Central Asia. But on a human level, a lot of these people are just trying to raise kids and, provide for families and try to do something fun on Saturdays. And, it's just like anywhere else in the world. And whenever you really have an oppressive regime, it's you really do see just, basic kind of things that we in America might take for granted: clean water, access to, a good doctor, and access to schools that just teach boys and girls how to read and write, et cetera. You just see how all of these things are stifled. And then for our money, I was there obviously as a missionary. I had some run-ins with, some police and jurists that weren't excited about what I was doing, and so I got to experience some justice systems in those necks of the woods. And again, you see, if you kind of step out of line a little bit, due process is a thing of the imagination in a lot of those places. And so, I personally, I think about those things often. To be honest, I still have a lot of friends. The situation in Afghanistan last year, where the botched kind of pull out for the U.S. And I was in up to my neck trying to help a lot of friends get out of some very, very dire scenarios there. So in some ways that was a long time ago for me personally, but there are still kind of remnants or echoes of that still are in my heart as well as in my professional life on an ongoing kind of constant basis.
And I would imagine it helps to inform your work as you really, with the Faith and Freedom Coalition, you work to defend these core principles and values that really keep this nation strong. And I know you all have done a good bit of work in the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. And also, it was First Step Act. Mm-hmm. And so how did Faith and Freedom engage in those?
Well, the Stop Online Sexual Trafficking Act, so SESTA and FOSTA were basically two bills that kind of got fused a little bit towards the end. That was
I was in the House and chairman of Comms and Tech.
You were in the thick of that for sure.
Yes, fill in kind of how you all engaged in that.
So the basic gist of it was that a lot of online platforms really had no accountability if their platforms were being used as a medium for people to buy and sell, basically to solicit, especially minors, but really anybody. Mm-hmm. And so what SESTA and FOSTA did was it made the kind of the most known or renowned group was referred to as Backpage.com. There were others that did the same thing, but Backpage was the most visited or trafficked. And basically, if they were kind of knowingly or negligently being used for these kinds of transactions, they shared in some culpability because the Communications Decency Act back in the 90s did not contemplate these kinds of practices. Here 20 years later, 30 years later. So really a huge opportunity to make sure that the platforms that were being used, basically people can log in and say, I'm looking for, a certain kind of person to do certain kind of activities. And if these platforms were aware of this kind of trafficking, they could be financially, civilly liable and potentially even criminally liable. And so, it's probably too long a story to go into today, but there were some very interesting kind of behind the scenes interactions once we started getting very public on that I personally wound up having some interesting experiences with some organizations and people affiliated with some online some no doubt your listeners will be aware of a lot of the kind of day-to-day organizations that started getting some very interesting interactions.
And I think it's so important when you talk about how traditional values can influence an issue, and you look at cleaning up the public online space, and that is what the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act did. And as it came to the House and we put FOSTA and SESTA together to have people aware that this was really taking place. I think there were a lot of people that wanted to say, oh, that's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
But indeed it was, and it was quite an issue, and you all were very impactful in that regard. I have to ask you, what does freedom mean to you individually? What does it mean to Faith and Freedom Coalition? How is that nugget a driver for your day?
Great question. Freedom, a lot of these words that we kind of use vernacularly they're really loaded concepts, both in our own minds and also biblically, actually. And so, the concept of freedom, and also you can talk about liberty biblically, are the way that I would say it is basically the ability to live out our destiny in an unfettered way. And so, there are kind of governmental aspects to that. I would argue there are issues related to kind of your will, a person's will and soul that are kind of implicated in that. But freedom is, it's almost one of these things that we don't fully even recognize or kind of identify until you don't have it. And, I think a lot of people started to feel a little bit of that on a regular basis during 2020 when, probably the most, palatable way that Americans probably maybe have ever experienced it. Certainly this generation of Americans have ever experienced it when they literally were told you can't do these basic functions of your life. And so, the absence of something almost can help us appreciate or put our finger on something more so than when we actually do have it. And so I think when we're talking about either religious issues or just kind of basic, travel and commerce, certainly speech, when that's checked by somebody else and not by your own will or desire, I think that's where we really start to appreciate and relish the sacredness of freedom. And so I think that more people are mindful of that now than they were 3 years ago, say. So for me, freedom is the ability to basically pursue God's intention for each of us, his desire and destiny for each of us without other people either imposing on us or limiting us.
And I think that so many of our listeners will agree with you on that, and you articulate that so well. Thank you for joining us today, and I know they're going to want to keep up with you. They can follow you on Twitter at Timothy Head, and the Faith and Freedom Coalition is on Twitter at Faith and Freedom. You're on Facebook at Faith and Freedom Coalition, and the website is ffcoalition.com. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for everything you do.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom Rings. You can follow me on Twitter at Vote Marsha, Facebook at Marsha Blackburn for Senate, and on Instagram at Team Marsha. And you can always find us online at marshablackburn.com. The Freedom Rings podcast is edited and produced by Jared Cummings. Executive producers are Conservative Partnership Center and Marsha Blackburn. Together, we make Freedom Ring.